So my goal today is to lay out the argument that infrastructure provides the substrate for today's world order, and that thinking in terms of infrastructure can not only improve how we understand markets, but also geopolitics. So this argument relies on a set of foundational assumptions that it's worth clarifying at the outset. The first is the claim that modern social relations are mediated by and inextricable from infrastructure. In other words, the ways that we now relate to each other and to our governments depend on intricate engineering, construction, and technological systems, from energy grids to telecommunications. The second claim is that those networks are themselves densely interconnected and interdependent, such that collectively they provide a sort of substrate of modern existence. Modern payment systems, for example, require complex fiber optic networks, which are themselves dependent on globalized supply chains and specialized production systems, like silicon chip manufacturing. The feedback loops of interdependence go on and on. The final claim is that our reliance on infrastructure has reshaped power dynamics in today's world, and the sooner we realize that and reorient both market thinking and policy making, the better off we'll be at tackling global challenges. In sum, infrastructure serves as the foundation of modern world order. This foundation enables some incredible things. The fact that we're all here today is itself a feat of modern infrastructure. We booked trips that depended on global digital payment systems. We accessed our tickets, often using QR codes on our smartphones. We crossed international borders, sometimes with little more than a retinal scan. Our lives are the products of these interconnected networks, and recognizing this can lead to better policymaking and business thinking. All right, so let's bring this abstract claim back down to a concrete example. What's more powerful, Elon Musk or Greece? Greece has a GDP of about 215 billion, and Elon Musk's net worth registers at about 210. So in terms of wealth, they can look roughly comparable. But recent events and yesterday's talks underscored that in infrastructure power, Musk's decisions have impacts that far surpass his stockpiled wealth. At several points during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he could determine almost unilaterally whether Ukrainian forces could retaliate against Russia. And he could do this in part because of his network of low Earth orbiting satellites operated by his company Starlink. In short, Elon Musk punches far above his weight class in infrastructure power. This way of thinking in terms of infrastructure rather than other metrics for rating power help explain the seemingly outsized influence of a number of actors in today's headlines. Houthi rebels are another example. While its army is relatively small, the Houthis can wield tremendous infrastructure power, in part because their actions jeopardize a global trading chokepoint in the Red Sea. This waterway sees the passage of roughly 15% of global seaborne trade. The Houthis' attacks on commercial ships can imperil global supply chains because the alternative routes raise costs and significantly increase travel times. The risks of Houthi attacks are compounded further still because of the entanglement of global shipping with other networks. In February, an anti-ship missile fired by the Houthis hit the Ruby Mar, which was a Belize-flagged cargo ship owned by a Lebanese management company registered in the Marshall Islands with a UK shipping address that the Houthis described as British. And the ship was carrying 18,000 tons of fertilizer to Bulgaria. Its spill created an environmental hazard that threatened coral reefs and coastal populations' drinking water. And it hit telecommunications networks because the ship's anchor seems to have cut several undersea cables. After all, as we heard yesterday, the Red Sea is a telecommunications channel through which 17% of global data traffic flows. As the ship sank, it disrupted internet traffic and connectivity among Asia, Europe, and Africa. In other words, the Houthis' ability to leverage infrastructure power snarled global trade, telecommunications, and ecosystems. So how do these observations help us make sense of the future of markets? One insight that follows from this way is a new way of framing the relationship between governments and markets. The traditional model of international relations tends to view states as the primary organizing units of global affairs. So in this scheme, we often look at governments and heads of state as leading actors. But in today's infrastructure-dominated geopolitics, companies can be every bit as decisive as governments, and cyber attacks as costly as territorial strikes. In other words, a key insight is that a new set of power brokers are reshaping global affairs beyond the domain of traditional governments. Actors like NVIDIA, the financial firm BlackRock, and of course, Elon Musk. Companies and entities that control the hardwiring of our daily lives. And the emergence of these new power brokers suggests that we need to move beyond two-dimensional views of public-private partnerships to develop more dynamic models. Infrastructure almost always requires both governments and business actors, from financing to licensing to maintenance. It's not about either state or business leadership, it's about how the two come together, structure their interactions, and build systems. So this finding is one of the takeaways from my historical research on US banking overseas. In my forthcoming book, Dollars and Dominion, I look at the emergence of a new financial infrastructure of US global power in the early 20th century through the creation of a network of overseas bank branches. These bank branches operated like the less glamorous cousin of the better-known J.P. Morgan bankers who participated in major sovereign lending and economic diplomacy around World War I. In fact, it's the relative hiddenness of branch banks' work that makes them really interesting. Infrastructure often looks like the mundane circuitry and the boring ductwork until things go wrong. We tend to notice infrastructure when it fails or when it needs building in the first place. Otherwise, its invisibility, its taken for grantedness, is often part of its power. So I map this circuitry in Dollars and Dominion to understand a moment of great power transition, when the United States shifted from a global debtor to becoming essentially the world's banker and a powerhouse in global relations. US banks thrived overseas, branches thrived overseas in part because of the unique design of the early Federal Reserve System. I will spare you a detour in the lengthy history of the Fed, but suffice it to say that the original Federal Reserve had a markedly different design from today's Fed. The original architecture placed a liquidity premium for a particular type of trade credit known as a banker's acceptance, which conveyed advantages to banks with extensive overseas operations. The Fed not only authorized this market in dollar-denominated banker's acceptances, it also bought millions of dollars in acceptances itself, thereby privileging the market for acceptances over other types of investments. The upshot of all of this is that the Fed's inner workings reduce the risks and increase the revenue generation potential for US banks operating overseas. This system of privileges and opportunities, of regulations and legal protections, bolstered a new infrastructure for expanding US commerce abroad. This story aligns with some of the insights we've heard here in Inglesburg about public and private actors' involvement in markets. So the themes of this seemingly obscure moment in history also have contemporary relevance in some surprising ways as we think about today's infrastructure politics and the new challenges presented by China, especially in building and controlling modern infrastructure. So here, the example of China's Belt and Road Initiative often jumps to mind, and rightly so. China has been working for over a decade, pouring more than $1 trillion in projects in over 150 countries to build massive installations in transportation, energy, and trade, among other domains. And there's plenty of evidence that such large-scale construction can convey meaningful geopolitical advantages. Interestingly, infrastructure doesn't necessarily have to be good to shape history. Sometimes it's enough just to be in the right place at the right time. So this was the lesson for the often inept US bankers who established a ragtag network of branches around the world before World War I. When the world changed, and suddenly overseas markets wanted US dollars, they were the ones in place with contacts and networks to fill the demand. It's also the longer-term knock-on effects of infrastructure building that can convey geopolitical advantages. British railway construction in the 19th century is evidence of this point. If your bankers structure the loans and your engineers design the tracks, more often than not, it will be your nation's firms that get called on for repairs and servicing. And these knock-on effects led British managers and workers to create expat enclaves that sometimes endured to become more lasting and sustained ties. More recently, China has refined its infrastructure investing to focus on projects that align with its strategic goals, instead of pouring money into mega projects like hydropower. At least in Latin America, recent Chinese investments have focused on more targeted areas around telecommunications and renewable energy. And these projects highlight sectors like solar energy, where China already has competitive advantages or wants to develop its strengths. And here, I think the US has been a little slow to refine an infrastructure strategy. Sure, there's been an outpouring of money and interest, but the goal of trying to best China in mega infrastructure building doesn't exactly play to US strengths. Of the 20 largest construction contractors in the world, 14 are Chinese, and not a single one is from the US. The US government isn't really in the business of direct infrastructure building anyway. Its strengths are much more in the financing, coordination, design, and partnerships for long-term oversight. Another insight is that today's infrastructure competition could lead to a sort of bifurcation or cleavage in two infrastructure blocks, unraveling recent trends towards globalization. And signs of this have emerged in a few places, like around electric vehicles, as the United States and the EU have imposed steep tariffs that incentivize the growth of non-Chinese technologies and manufacturing. Another area involves global shipping and trade. US policymakers have viewed China's ascendance in global shipping with wariness and even alarm. Chinese firms have a presence in roughly 3/5 of the world's busiest ports outside of China. It produces more than 90% of the world's shipping containers and more than 80% of the massive portside cranes that unload them. China's also invested in the information platforms and the systems that accompany the global movement of goods. In December, US Congress passed a bill barring the Pentagon from using any port that relies on a Chinese logistics platform known as logging that has gained inroads at transportation hubs in Europe and Asia. And all of this starts to look like two emerging islands of infrastructure interoperability, where standards diverge and technological systems no longer speak to each other. That development has major implications for governments and markets alike. In particular, it presents a real challenge to business models that have relied on ever-expanding access to consumer data. With late 20th century globalization, companies could bet on a seemingly endless cycle of providing services, gaining access to consumer data, and using this data to offer new services for which they could charge even more fees. But infrastructure bifurcation disrupts this sort of flywheel set of effects. Data gets sticky, localized, and encumbered. The trend also suggests that a new set of intermediaries and gateways could become increasingly important for both markets and governments. Places like Singapore, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha have positioned themselves as having a foot in US-EU infrastructure as well as in China-linked growth. These intermediaries and locations could develop outsized importance if the forking paths of infrastructure development become increasingly divergent. Finally, just to end on a more hopeful note, infrastructure dependence also creates opportunities for shared wins and new ways to collaborate around challenges like climate change and AI governance, which have so far defied the problem-solving mechanisms associated with traditional world order. If we loosen the strictures of nation-state framing and start thinking in terms of the new power brokers of infrastructure politics, it quickly becomes apparent that the world needs new decision-making entities and forums. Infrastructure is not just about exploiting each other's vulnerabilities, it's also about maximizing the space for better problem-solving. Infrastructure gives us a nimbler analytical tools for tackling some of the most pressing problems we face as a planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When you say that we need new decision-making entities, can you give us an idea what that would be?
I've heard people talk about like a new G20 for infrastructure. I don't know exactly what the model would be, because I think the idea of people sitting around a table might be a little too static for it. It would be interesting to see other kind of more dynamic models of what that kind of problem solving would look like. One piece of it is definitely who is at the table, but I think how they could be involved in the kind of a scaffolded model for problem solving would be a really interesting way to go about things. I think it would be one interesting project that I've thought about is a sort of best practices in infrastructure development and what that could look like to kind of identify or pull out some of those approaches.
All right, thank you very much.